Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Karen, for inviting me to come back. Sir, it is always a pleasure. Last time we were together, it was virtual, and this is a heck of a lot better. It was a great introduction, but one thing you left out, he's a great writer. This is a really good book. I had to read Max Boot's book, which is also good, but that was 735 pages. Your book went by a lot quicker, so thank you for that. So, I think one of the interesting things about Washington is that very often people, despite where their political persuasion may be, they work together. Tell us about some of the conversations you had with Henry Kissinger or Condoleezza Rice prior to taking the position as National Security Advisor.
Well, thanks, Jim, for that question. And Karen, thank you so much for the privilege of being with you. Chris, thanks for that very kind introduction. It was such a privilege to work with you. And Chris served with great distinction and is one of the reasons why the Trump administration was able to deliver the Abraham Accords, an endeavor that everybody thought was impossible, that was ridiculed. And Chris and the team that he worked with and supported and directed just did a fantastic job. So great to see you. Well, Jim, that was one of the most fun things I did early in the job, and I'm a historian, and I think the study of history is in many ways a kind of an act of humility, right? Because you recognize that it's not just your own experience that you can draw on or that you should draw on as you take on new responsibilities, that you should endeavor to learn from the experiences of others. And the previous national security advisors were all very gracious. I spoke with or met with all of them within my first couple of weeks on the job. And of course, I had studied the role of the National Security Advisor. I had written a book about how and why Vietnam had become an American war and been quite critical of McGeorge Bundy, who was Lyndon Johnson's National Security Advisor. So it was quite a surreal feeling to walk into that office and then realize, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, you know what I mean? You're now in charge of the national security policy-making, decision-making process that you criticize from the perspective of a historian. So I wanted to get all the help I could get. And of course, Dr. Kissinger was one of the first people to visit me. I think it was my second day on the job, and he had read Dereliction of Duty, was kind about that, and then the point that he made that I think is really important to remember, he said, the National Security Advisor is the only person in the national security establishment who has the president as his or her only client. And he said, you have to really remember that it is your job then to advocate for the president, to make sure the president gets the best advice, as Chris alluded to, and that comes across from all of the departments and agencies. And that's not just what you think, right? Because none of us are ubiquitous, except maybe, or omniscient, I should say. None of us are omniscient except maybe my successor. And
everybody, John Bolton.
and Chris also said that the second big part of that duty responsibility, or your duty responsibility, is to give multiple options to the president. And that reinforced what Brent Scowcroft had endeavored to do. This is what is often called, Jim, as you know well, the Scowcroft model of being the National Security Advisor, recognizing that you're not omniscient, right? That you have to work together across all departments and agencies to give the president multiple options. That's important because it's in the comparison of those options, oftentimes, that you can draw out long-term costs and consequences. And it's also in the comparison of those options the president can make, I think, the best decision and determine his or her only foreign policy. I mean, nobody elects you as National Security Advisor, right? So the president deserves multiple options. And then I got great advice from everybody, who I talked to. Jim, Jeffrey, the Obama administration, General
Jones.
Yeah, right. He had done a fantastic job in convening all of the national security advisors a couple of times for dinners, and so everybody was gracious. I learned a lot from them, and I write about that in the book. I kind of distill the advice from each of them. Some of them were policy related. Some of the advice was more about personalities, relationships. I don't know why this is cutting out. And should I go without? Should I try to go without it? This, like President Trump, should we just play my playlist? Do you play my list?
Yeah.
All right, so I turned that one off, just in case that was what was happening. And I'll turn this one off when it goes back to you, Jim. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I didn't know was sick, and passed away maybe a month and a half later. He was supposed to be half an hour on the phone. It was like an hour and a half on the phone with me. So all of them gave a lot of their time, and I tried to distill that in the book. And I hope that maybe, future national security advisors will benefit from the advice, not just from me in my time as national security advisor, but the advice of the others that I was able to glean.
The National Security Advisor had the very best relations with the Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger because he held both positions. So is it structurally a position that perhaps is ill-conceived?
No, I don't think it's ill-conceived. I don't think it's ill-conceived. I think that really, it's a great question. There is natural tension. There definitely is. And my relationship with Secretary Tillerson confirmed, yes, there definitely is natural tension between the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. But I think that sometimes can be constructive. I don't think it was particularly constructive between me and the Secretary of State. But it's important to recognize that the heads of the other departments and agencies, they do have other constituencies, their own departments. And I don't buy into this whole narrative, Jim, of like a deep state that it makes its own foreign policy. But there is tremendous bureaucratic inertia across the departments and agencies. And oftentimes it takes a national security advisor to help the president identify alternatives to the status quo, because the bureaucrats in Washington love the status quo, even as it's failing. They want it to continue to fail rather than change a lot of times in terms of certain policies. And it's important to be able to help the president break through that, but also the integration function. I mean, the National Security Council staff began to evolve after the National Security Act at the end of World War II. And that National Security Act of 1947 was aimed in part at addressing what is seen as some of the strategic failures associated with the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. And the idea is that you have to be able to integrate all perspectives from your diplomatic organizations, intelligence organizations, and defense organizations in particular, to be able to understand the challenges and opportunities we're facing internationally, but actually, even more importantly, to integrate all elements of national power, as well as efforts of like-minded partners to overcome obstacles to progress, take advantage of opportunities, and advance U.S. interests. So I believe in the process. I think that it's always, oftentimes it's problematic. It's always problematic. And one of the things that helped me work through these issues, the story in the book is one of encountering these obstacles, one of the themes of the book. But it's really a story of how we worked hard to transcend those obstacles and get a lot of good work done, despite the friction that we had with some members of the administration.
Do you feel that President Trump really understood your role, and should you have perhaps spent more time with him before accepting the position to be sure that you were aligned?
Well, I think before, and especially after accepting the position, even more time talking to him about what my role was relative to others. And there's some great scholars of presidential leadership. I'm thinking of, for example, Alexander George, who was a great scholar at Stanford for many years. Freddie Greenstein was at Princeton, and they talk about different dimensions of leadership when they talk about presidential leadership. And when you read it, you think, well, nobody's going to have all those qualities. But one of those is organizational leadership capacity and ability. And the basis of that is oftentimes just understanding the roles of the key people in your government, how they're supposed to work together. And I think President Trump, because of his background, coming from a real estate organization where he always had a small circle of people, he would tend to just tell everybody to do the same thing oftentimes. And how that works out, really, but not usually pretty well. Or he didn't really understand where the problems were in implementation of his guidance and so forth. So I wish I write about this when I interviewed with him. I write about the interview with President Trump, and then as I reflected on it, I realized, the one question that I wish he had asked me was, hey, tell me how you see your role as National Security Advisor and how we should interact and how that's different from my relationship with my cabinet officials. And we never really had that conversation. And so I think that set me back with him a little bit, but also set me back getting maybe his mandate for the process that we ran. We ran effectively, but we ran against some really considerable opposition from really two main cabinet officials.
One of the things in your book that I found concerning was how you talked about essentially three different groups that were in the administration. And I'll let you describe those groups. But what gives you confidence, or do you have confidence, that it might be different in a second administration?
Well, I described really the base motivation of people who serve in any White House. And I think this is true in any administration. So, I was in my 33rd year of service. I was beginning my 34th year of service when I joined the Trump administration, when President Trump asked me to serve as National Security Advisor. And my whole career was in the military was built on serving your commander-in-chief, no matter who the heck the commander-in-chief is, and to understand that your role is not to make policy. Your role is to help civilian leaders make the best decision they can, and then implement their decisions, because they're the people who got elected, right? Generals don't get elected, right? So they're not accountable to the American people. And so that's how I approached my role there. I had not been a political person at all. I mean, in fact, I had never voted. I had taken the oath of service at age 17 at West Point, and I followed the example of George Marshall in the belief that there should be a bold line between the military and partisan politics.
And you also never served in the Pentagon.
I never served. This is my first tour of duty in Washington, which is National Security Advisor. Right? So there are a number of reasons here that I'm getting to. That's why I only lasted 13 months, right? So the second group of people, though, I think this is in any administration again, they're there not to help the president, implement his or her agenda. They're there to advance their own agenda. They come into the administration with policies that they know they want to get the president to approve. And then there's a third group of people who take on the role of saving the country and the world from the president, right? And so, this is kind of like an anonymous writer. And the problem with that second and third groups are, not only do they not serve the president well, but actually they undermine the Constitution. Again, because if sovereignty lies with the people, nobody elected them. And so this misunderstanding of roles, I think, created a lot of tension between me and some others and those who had those kind of base motivations.
Where do you put Rex Tillerson and Jim Mattis?
Group three for sure, and they could say, I mean, I write this in the book, I have no axe to grind with anybody. I mean, they were trying to serve the country as best they could. That's what they thought they were doing. There was a lot of tension between us, and I try to explain that tension, from my perspective, but also to have some empathy for them, describe it from their perspective. And you might say that there's kind of ex post facto justification for their belief that President Trump was an emergency. I mean, I think how they saw him as an emergency that had to be contained, based on the January 6th assault on the Capitol, for example. But in the period of time that I'm writing about, we were just trying to give the president options and help the president make the best decision. I think not only were they wrong to behave this way in terms of obstructing the collaborative process to bias policy in favor of their controlling it. I used to joke with them. I was like, hey, whenever you're ready for your club of two, to become a club of three, I'm embarrassingly free. I'm free. But also I think it wasn't effective with Donald Trump. I mean, if you go to Donald Trump and you say, hey, everybody agrees, this is the best policy. There's no dissent at all. All you have to do is sign right here. He'll do the opposite just to spite everybody. He's reflexively contrarian, right? And if he thinks he's being slow-rolled or he's not being shown some information or analysis, who knows what he's going to do? So I thought it was the best way to serve him is the best way to serve any president. Don't limit the information that gets to him. Don't limit the options. Give him more options. And when we briefed him on issues where he was predisposed to do something completely different, oftentimes what we did is we briefed his preferred option first.
Then we briefed other alternatives, and he chose alternatives. But what we would do before we even brought him options, which I think was effective, and I described this in the book, Jim, is we conducted framing sessions for our most significant challenges and opportunities internationally. And in those framing challenges, we applied design thinking to what was initially a list of 16 first-order challenges to national security. And those framing discussions revolved around what is the nature of the challenge? The second thing, which is really important for Trump especially, but for any president, is like, so what? Why do we care about this challenge? And so we would identify the vital interests that were at stake and then view that challenge through the lens of those vital interests and craft an overarching goal and more specific objectives. And there were other parts to this, but that was the crux of it. We also identified assumptions that should underpin our policy, and then I would bring that to President Trump. Before I was asking him for a decision on anything to do, I would say, hey, do you agree with this? Is this the nature of the challenge? Do you think these are our interests? Should these be our objectives? And then when you come back with options, you have the benefit of already having agreement on what we're trying, on that framing. And so you could relate ideas that he might have, or somebody whispers in his ear, which was fine with me. It would freak some people out, believe me, about some of the things that President Trump would say. But oftentimes what he was doing is challenging the conventional wisdom. Like, so when he said, hey, General, why don't we bomb them? Bomb what, Mr. President? The labs, the drug labs in Mexico. And I'm like, okay, well, there are probably some issues with that, but hey, I think I get what you're saying. What you're saying is, at the time, 60,000 Americans are dying every year from fentanyl. And what he was telling me, the way I heard it, because I was with him every day and multiple times a day, I didn't hear that he wanted us to bomb the labs. What I heard is, hey, bring me options to do something different, And so that's what I tried to do, and try to work together with the other departments and agencies, cabinet members to do that.
We're going to come back to some of the successes and issues that you've seen comparing the Biden administration and Trump term. But in the book, and I didn't count how many times you said this, but you use the adjective disruptive person.
Yeah.
And so I went and looked up the synonyms for disruptive. Unsettling, disturbing, troublesome. Is that someone we want to have access to the nuclear codes?
Hey, I think that's up to you. It's up to all of you. So this has been tough for me. I got to tell you. I mean, it's hard to write a book without it being regarded as partisan in this day and age, right? And I don't think I don't bring like a partisan view. That's not going to help you. I don't think it's going to help Americans. So what I try to do in the book is lay out the good, the bad, and the ugly of my experience there, and my observations of President Trump and his administration, but also to try to place that time in context of the years that preceded President Trump and the years that followed, so that everybody can make their own decisions on, is this the person you want? Because it's a relative choice, right? I mean, we're not picking the ideal candidate we can conjure in our minds. We've got the two who we have. And I think that that's a difficult choice for Americans, but it's your choice, not my choice. And so I think that, what's I hope a value in the book is it gives you, I think, more information and ability to make that choice for yourself.
So, Karen, I have to congratulate you for the timing of tonight's program, because Brexit is meeting today. And one thing that surprised me, I looked this up just a little while ago.
BRICS.
BRICS, thank you. 36 countries now are a member. Turkey has, whatever this means, has applied for membership, represents 45% of the world's population, 35% of the global economy, and there's a photo that is now making its way on the internet of President Putin and President Xi basically holding hands. Should we be concerned?
Yeah, I think we should be concerned for a number of reasons, but BRICS would be pretty far down on the list. But I think overall, Jim, what we're seeing is a coalescing of an axis of aggressors that involve two revanchist or revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass, China and Russia, and have brought into the fold, really, I think, what are de facto alliances, allies in Iran and in North Korea. And what binds them together? They all have their individual agendas as countries, but what binds them together is their desire to tear down the existing international order and the rules of discourse economically, financially, from a human rights perspective, from a security perspective, and to replace it with a new order that is sympathetic to their authoritarian forms of government, and in China's case in particular, its statist, mercantilist economic model. I think the stakes are extremely high in this competition. BRICS is a way that they're trying to advance their interests from an economic and a financial perspective. One of the big elements on the agenda for this BRICS meeting is an alternative form of payments among the BRICS member nations that bypasses the use of the dollar as the reserve currency and thereby diminishes our ability to place sanctions on individuals, to counter any kind of money laundering and financing of illicit activities or sanctioned entities or countries. So that should be disturbing, but it also has a big informational or kind of public diplomacy perspective from that. What they're trying to do is cast the United States in the role of oppressor, and the system is being oppressive. And, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, they're there to liberate everybody, from this kind of, this capitalist, imperialist United States system, which of course, we are terrible at countering, and actually, maybe in large measure because this is what we teach in the humanities departments of most of our universities. Communism is only succeeding for these totalitarian regimes and in universities in the UK and the United States. So I think it's a significant challenge. BRICS is part of that much more significant challenge.
But when you look at the countries that are members, Saudi Arabia is not yet, it's sort of sitting on the fence, but Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, UAE, and then we look at the sanctions that we're trying to put in place against Russia, and these countries that are supposed to be our allies, heck, they're the ones that are helping bust these sanctions.
Yeah. I think in some ways what we have to do is, some people say you have to back off, right? Because your use of sanctions, what it's doing is it is encouraging, incentivizing these countries to find alternative methods of payment, which in the long term diminishes U.S. power. I tend to think the opposite. I think we need to enforce sanctions more rigorously. And hey, if you're Ethiopia or whoever, who do you want to do business with? And China has a lot of economic heft. This is one of the reasons why China and Russia are working together, because they compensate for each other's weaknesses. Russia has an economy the size of Texas's economy. It's smaller than Texas's economy. And China can help compensate by bringing that economic and financial prowess to bear. But China's got a lot of problems these days, right? And I think that we have opportunities, to strengthen like-minded countries, especially the United States, members of the EU, the UK, Japan. Add that up together, that's the 55%, of the world's economy. India, if India can come off the fence, who knows? I doubt it in the near term. But it's a competition, and I think we just have to recognize it is a competition. I think we've been way too passive for way too long, and actually, while we were asleep, is when you saw the coalescing of these groups and the undermining of the existing order. Not, I don't think, because we've been too aggressive. I think because we vacated arenas of competition, economic, financial, diplomatic, informational, law enforcement, that are critical to this competition.
So when did we go to sleep? Somebody asked in Dallas, who worked in the administration, they said, ask HR this, would October 7th have happened? Would February 22nd happen when Russia invaded Ukraine if there'd been a second Trump administration?
It's impossible to say for sure, but I'll just say I don't think so. And the reason I say I don't think so is because I believe that what has provoked the reinvasion of Ukraine and what has provoked the October 7th and the regional war that followed is the perception of weakness, the perception that U.S. and other European resolve was weak. Now that's not all Trump or Biden or even just the perception of the U.S. But our self-defeat in Afghanistan, the responsibility for which is shared between the Trump and the Biden administration, and the humiliating, really, withdrawal and deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan, I believe triggered the February 2021, February 2022 reinvasion of Ukraine. So August of 21, the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. What happens at that time, around that same time, is when Vladimir Putin is penning his long essay. Remember that he supposedly wrote, Ukraine's not even a thing. That's when they began to pre-position a lot of the combat equipment and logistical supplies. And then later they feigned their withdrawal, but they kept all of that in place for the reinvasion. I believe Putin decided in July, August of 2021 to reinvade Ukraine because of that perception of weakness. Now, the perception of weakness on the U.S. part, but also in Europe. Remember, Boris Johnson was in trouble for the parties, number 10. You had a very contentious French election that had just occurred. You had a weak stoplight government in Germany. So it was the overall assessment of the perception of weakness. On October 7th, what could have triggered it? I think, again, perception of weakness. We, at the time, were proving unable to sustain our support for Ukraine because of the razor-thin Republican majority in Congress that gave kind of neo-isolationists the ability to block that support coming to a vote in the House of Representatives. I think the supreme leader in Iran said, hey, they can't even support Ukraine after they said as long as it takes, and we're with you to the end. Maybe they won't come to the aid of Israel. And hey, Biden doesn't like Netanyahu and vice versa. So maybe that gives us an opportunity. Look at what was happening internal to Israel at the time with the judicial reform efforts and the popular discontent associated with that. So I could go on and on about other, and we weren't responding to any of the attacks against us in the region, hundreds of them by the Iranians. The Biden administration instead was supplicating to the Iranians in this period of time in the effort to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal. We relaxed our enforcement of sanctions against Iran, which resulted in the transfer of about $100 billion into the coffers of the Iranians. We kept giving them payoffs. Remember, $6 billion, I think it was, Chris, was sitting in a Gutteries bank on the eve of October 7th to transfer back to the Iranians. And in our negotiation efforts with them, our envoy, Rob Malley, was suffering the humiliation of not being allowed even to talk directly to them. And guess who we used as our interlocutors? The Russians. So if you looked out from Iran's perspective, why wouldn't you set loose? You're looking at your to-do list, destroy Israel's on it, right? Why not cross that off on October 7th? So I think rather than the question of if it had been a second Trump administration, I think it's important to examine why we have had these cascading crises and why there's a severe danger that these crises will cascade further and devolve into a world war. And I know there's a lot of hyperbole about that now, but I think it's not without justification. If you look at what China is doing now across the Indo-Pacific region, it is kind of unprecedented. Not completely unprecedented, but ramming and sinking vessels, 7 acts of war against a U.S. treaty ally in the Philippines in the month of August. Laying claim to the ocean and now trying to make good on it with more so-called enforcement. The soft blockade they just implemented on Taiwan a couple of days ago, violating Japanese airspace for the first time ever with PLA aircraft just in the last couple of months. It doesn't look good to me. If you look at his rhetoric as well, and now of course you see the connection between all this because you have North Korea providing 2 million artillery shells and missiles, now providing troops that are training in Russia. I think you're going to see tens of thousands of North Korean troops fighting against the Ukrainians. You have China buying more and more Russian energy to feed Putin's ATM, but they're also providing the hardware and the equipment necessary to sustain his war-making machine. You have Iran providing missiles and drones to the Russians. Russians are providing technical assistance, aircraft, fighter aircraft, and so forth. There are now, reports that North Korean pilots are training in Russia to be employed against Ukraine. So, that kind of sounds dangerous to me, right? And I think that a lot of the reason why we see these crises cascading and growing is this perception of weakness.
So I'm sure many people in this room have read David Sanger's recent book, In Cold Wars, and he reminds us that one of the reasons that Kissinger and Nixon worked together to resume or have relations with China was to drive a wedge between Russia and China. Is that something we should be thinking about doing now? And if so, how would we go about it?
I think we should think about it and then say, it's not gonna happen, and do the opposite. I think we should super glue them together, or tie them together. Not only because they deserve each other, but because when we pretend like they're separate, they cover for each other. And then we suffer the humiliation, self-inflicted, Oh, I think we should talk to the Chinese about, getting the Houthis to back off a little bit. I mean, really? Do we really think that's gonna happen? I mean, you have an Iranian IRGC general in the port of Hodeidah, commanding and controlling all the Houthi missiles. Guess how many get fired at Chinese vessels? None. That's not a coincidence. You have an Iranian vessel sitting off the coast of Djibouti that is conducting all the radar collection and intelligence to orchestrate the Houthis. The Houthis, believe me, there are no missile factories, in Yemen. They just do cotton. They don't really do a lot. They don't have a defense industrial base. We know that's all coming from Iran. So we act like we don't know this. Like, I don't know why that ship is not on the bottom of the ocean. Why is that RGC general, why isn't he gone? Why haven't we run over the Houthis physically? I just don't, I think all of this, the continued escalation is because they can get away with it. And every time we confront a new act of aggression, 180 attacks against US forces and installations, acts of war against us by Iranian proxies since October 7th of last year. 180 of them. We responded to 11 of them. 11 of them. And so it's this perception of weakness. And what do we hear every time there's an attack like this? We need to de-escalate, right? And it's this folly of de-escalation, which to the supreme leader and RGC leaders, that sounds like license to escalate on their own terms with impunity.
So this is slightly an advertisement for my podcast, which Karen and supports. But tomorrow I'll be interviewing James Wilson in a book about America's Cold Warrior, Paul Nitze. And he was instrumental in drafting National Security NSC 68, which was based on peace through strength. What's wrong with our messaging? What needs to be done so the American public understands the requirements to have a strong offense?
Okay, so, hey, in what sport does it work to only play defense? As far as I'd say first, right? That's what we're doing in the Middle East. It's what our friend Joel Rayburn points out oftentimes. We're like a sports team that only plays defense. Remember after Iran fired, 500, 600 projectiles at Israel in April, we said, take the win. Really? Take the win. So I think it's really important for us to recognize to have a good defense, you have to have not only the offensive capability, but the demonstrated will to use it. Deterrence comes from capability times will. It's an equation. You can have tons of capabilities, but if your will is zero, your deterrent value is zero. And so I think it's important for us not to, have the military sword response to everything. But when there are clear acts of aggression against us, we have to act like it. The second would be to send a signal that we're taking the competition seriously. The Biden administration's defense budget, when adjusted for inflation, is a reduction in real terms, in terms of the defense budget. We're reducing the size of all of our armed forces at a time when it is quite clear we don't have the capacity. We have a bow wave, we have a triple whammy right now. Bow wave of deferred modernization, lack of capacity in our forces, and a recruiting problem. And I've not seen the administration give that the due attention it deserves. I think we're in a crisis period, and we're not acting like it. It's like what George Marshall said about the 1930s, late 1930s. He said when we had the time, we didn't have the money. And then when we had the money, we didn't have the time. And we should all remember, you framed the question perfectly, Jim. What should the American people hear from the president? They should hear, hey, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And to prevent one, we have to demonstrate the deterrent capability, and our willingness to use it. The second thing, besides our hard power, because it's really hard power that matters, right? I mean, nobody is afraid of Tony Blinken. I mean, he's doing a great job, but nobody's afraid of him. But you hear a lot about relentless diplomacy. What I think we should all remember is what George Shultz said. He said that negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the bargaining table. It's the integration of elements of power. So the second big thing is we have to get serious about supply chains and our industrial base. We have allowed it to atrophy too much based on China's mercantilist model and our unrealistic assumption that China would have to be welcomed into the international order economically, would play by the rules, and is trying to prosper, it will liberalize its economy, liberalize its foreign governments. It hasn't done that. It's weaponized its economy against us. It uses various forms of economic aggression, including large-scale cyber infiltration, cyber attacks, espionage to get access to our sensitive technologies and our intellectual property. It subsidizes its industries. It is getting a lock on supply chains so it can control critical materials. It has overcapacity, and so it dumps materials, commodities, as well as finished products on the international market to drive us out of business. We have to put into place a whole range of tools of economic statecraft, not to have a heavy-handed industrial policy, but to address the severe atrophy in our industrial base and the fragility of our supply chains. And then finally, I would say energy security is an area where we have a tremendous opportunity. I mean, we have just been shooting ourselves in the foot. I mean, we canceled a Canadian pipeline and green-lighted Nord Stream 2. I mean, how did that make sense? And then we declared a moratorium on U.S. LNG export facilities, or permitting for LNG export facilities, and encouraged Venezuela and others to pump more gas. And we put sanctions on Russian gas, but won't make up for that ourselves. So I just think we have a huge opportunity in the United States to tap into our tremendous energy potential, to do so in a way that reduces carbon emissions. Maybe with some taxation could fund a green transition and acceleration of some of these EM squared fission reactors and so forth. So I think the three things that Americans should be asking questions, but we don't really talk about. We either talk about joy or eating dogs. You know what I mean? And like presidential debates, I'm like, what? Can't we just have a question about, and an answer about a policy related to national security?
My friend HR, you have been threading the needle very carefully on this one question. And a full colonel asked me to ask you this. He said, phrase it carefully. So I'm taking it from your book when we're talking about President Trump. Putin and Erdogan were playing Trump. He would continue to delude himself about Putin, who continued to play him like a fiddle. It's pretty strong words.
Yeah.
So are you comfortable with President Trump having a second term?
Well, I'll tell you, I paused before I wrote a lot about this, about how foreign leaders would try to manipulate President Trump. Foreign leaders try to manipulate any president. They study them, they try to push their buttons, they want to get out of them what they want. What Vladimir Putin did, I think I write in there, that the Kremlin's, psychological analysts were working overtime, on Donald Trump. And what they appeal to is his desire for a big deal. Not a big deal for like nefarious purposes, but because Trump looks at Russia like, oh, remember you were saying all the time, wouldn't it be great if we got along? That'd be a good thing, not a bad thing. And what he thinks is that he can get something from Putin that will help improve our security, like strategic stability talks and agreements on arms control or greater transparency, or to convince Putin not to develop some of these very disruptive, nuclear weapons that he's developing. Or that he gets something, which is ridiculous to think this, but on cybersecurity or other areas of cooperation, maybe on Ukraine, he can end the war in 24 hours, right? But that Putin uses that desire to string President Trump along and to push his buttons. And also, he knows that President Trump believes that our allies, partners internationally have been free riding on the largesse of American taxpayers. So he'll always highlight, look how expensive it is for you in Afghanistan or in Syria, and didn't George W. Bush really screw up the whole Middle East, which Trump would agree with, and so it's really all your fault. Why don't you just leave the Middle East? It's a mess. It's a mess. What are you doing there? So that's the kind of thing that people say to President Trump. And of course, I would always, I would be there to say, hey, this guy's the best liar in the world. I would tell him, you're not the first one that Putin's manipulating. I told the story about George W. Bush when he first met with Putin, and Putin led a little crucifix dangle out of his shirt. Do you remember that story? And then of course, he knew President Bush was going to ask about it. He's like, hey, what's with the crucifix there, Vladimir? He said, well, my grandmother, her house burnt down when I was a young child, and the only thing that was left of her house was this crucifix, and so I've worn this every day. I mean,
He saw a soul.
yeah, then President Bush came back and said, I looked into his soul and I saw a man who cares about his people, President Obama, the reset button. Okay, this is after the invasion of Georgia. This is after the first invasion of Ukraine. I mean, really, the reset? How's that going to work? It didn't work. And he leaned over to Medvedev. Remember when Medvedev was keeping the seat warm for Putin? And he traded off missile defenses for Poland. In exchange for what? Nothing from Putin. So I would tell him these stories, and try to convince him, hey, Putin is going to press your buttons, and sadly there are people in the U.S. who are useful idiots for Putin. I mean, Tucker Carlson, the biggest useful idiot I don't know, in recent memory. Look at that long format interview we did with him, and then he brought this jackass, masquerading as a historian who said that Churchill was, it was a greater threat to the world than Hitler was. So I just think you have this kind of a nativist stream in the United States that somehow is sympathetic to Vladimir Putin. It's crazy to me. I analyze it in the book and try to explain it, but I think that makes up a very small element of President Trump's political base. And one of the ways that people can push Trump's buttons is if you do X, it will alienate your political base, right? And so these are the voices who are strongest on wanting to throw Ukraine under the bus or not support them any longer, and threaten them with a suspension of aid unless they agree to a ceasefire. Well,
And add, President Trump is very sensitive about Russia because of Russiagate and the perceptions.
Yeah.
Go with it.
okay, and that's an important point, right? It is very clear that these false allegations of collusion with Russia affected Trump. It hung over his head the whole time. The Mueller investigation, remember the media constantly about it all the time. The Durham report is worth reading. Okay, that was, the DOJ was completely out of line with all of this. And so for Trump, having been on the receiving end of that, now he kind of seems reflexive, about what should be the conventional wisdom, because it's right, that hey, Putin's not your friend. So what he would do, and I write about this in the book, he would conflate three questions. Question one, did Russia try to undermine our election? Hell yes, this is 2016 election. Question two, do they care who wins? I believe the answer to that is no. The Russians don't care at all who wins our elections. What they really, really want is large numbers of Americans to doubt the legitimacy of those elections. This is why President Trump is playing into their hands when he says, hey, it's not going to be fair. But this is why the Democrats play into their hands when there's a proposal to show your ID when you vote, and they call it Jim Crow. That's also playing into their hands. How is a more transparent system bad or voter suppression? So, we really, Vladimir Putin, I'm sure we have exceeded all of his expectations based on the degree to which, we continue to compromise our principles to score partisan points, or at least the political class does.
And you're really more concerned about Russia, even though their military does not seem to be as strong as we feared, but how they're able to use the gray zone and cyber and so forth.
Yeah, Russia is at war with us right now. Whether we acknowledge it or not. And with us, it's the United States, it's also Europe. And Russia is conducting a shadow war against us with cyber-enabled information warfare, with offensive cyber capabilities, and you've seen us uncovering more and more of some of these capabilities. But how about assassinations? How about support for fringe political groups, surreptitious support for fringe political groups? How about sabotage in Europe of railways, of infrastructure, cutting undersea cables? This is all happening right now. I've not seen anybody really pull this together, but Russia is conducting a shadow war against us. You can see it most clearly in political subversion. They tried and just failed in Moldova to organize an anti-EU vote there. but they've succeeded. They've got Orban in Hungary. They have Slovakia after meddling in that and trying to turn that election. They're going hard after Bulgaria right now, which has an election next year. And you see what they've done closer to home by really just annexing Belarus. Belarus has been annexed by Russia, and they've turned the Georgian government. Really, I think it gets the majority of the Georgian people through an effective subversion campaign there too. So it's all ongoing, and I think until we can respond effectively and impose costs on Russia beyond the costs they factor in before executing these acts of shadow war, I would call it, they're going to continue to push the limits of what they can get away with.
Well, this has been great, and I suspect we have lots of questions. Karen has promised me that. And we have a microphone, and while we're waiting for that, so I got to plug my podcast. I got to listen to yours today. Where is it? How often? What's the name of it?
Okay, so I really think it's dead in line with your mission, and please spread the word on it. It's called Battlegrounds, and it's crucial perspectives on key challenges internationally, and it's a long format interview with world leaders. So we've had, I think, about 60 or 70 maybe episodes now. Everybody from Prime Minister Abe before he was assassinated, King Abdullah, other heads of state. And because I'm a rugby player, I also did one with Richie McCaw. I know Richie McCaw, who one of the greatest rugby players of all time from New Zealand, and it's really what society can learn from rugby.
Well, it's a great podcast. I listened to it this morning at 5:45 driving here. Who has questions so we just get a sense of how many there are? Okay. I don't know people here, so folks with the mic, you all just walk around the room.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this guy looks like he's gonna beat me up if I don't.
Is it
Still
on?
good? Okay. I'm just very soft spoken.
Did you turn it on?
And I will ask that people ask questions and keep it what, where, why, when.
Well, thank you, General, for being here. Thank you for your distinguished service to our country. I myself spent 6 years in the Army, not saying that holds a candle to you, but one thing that I heard all throughout is that we have such poor defense metrics because we're not responding very well to what Russia and China are doing kind of on a day-to-day basis to kind of challenge our hegemony. And a lot of that, as you're starting to get into, has to do with like cybersecurity and kind of the Russian psyops and everything. There's subversion, there's reflexive control, and it's really worked with undermining elections, and a lot of them have talked about how they've really kind of played at internal divisions kind of from the outside. I know that you've got a great mind on that. I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail about that maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a great question. It certainly is it's a great description of what's happening. Russia's been doing this for a long time. I tell the story in the book that when I was when I received a phone call to go to Mar-a-Lago to interview for the job as National Security Advisor, I was briefing out a study that I commissioned 2 years earlier in 2014 to look at Russia's new generation warfare, and especially as it applied to the invasion of Ukraine, the first invasion of Ukraine. And we cataloged kind of all the tools that they were using and the inadequacy of our ability to respond to that. I think we are getting better with it. The Department of Justice has been mobilized, which I think is what we need internally. And I think whenever you get indictments, whenever you get these reports by the DOJ, they're very helpful in educating the American people. So I would say DOJ has got to remain focused on these campaigns of subversion. There's so many different aspects to it. From a cybersecurity perspective, I think what's really important is for every company, every private company that touches critical infrastructure or that holds sensitive data has to regard that infrastructure and that data as gold, and your company has to be Fort Knox. And you need a tiered and layered active cyber defense, but also what's really, I think, really important is to also look at how else they will come at your organization. A lot of it can be from internal threats, right? Insider threats of people who get inside your organization. I mean, this is what we had with the Snowden situation, for example. So you need a holistic approach to harden your enterprise. But from a national perspective, a good offense equals a good defense. And what General Paul Nakasone did when he was NSA, head of NSA, he took that place to the next level. We're already the best in the world. But some of the policy changes that President Trump put into place, combined with what Paul Nakasone did at Cybercom and NSA, has put us in a better situation. But then we have to do a lot more to secure critical infrastructure overall. A lot of it's just kind of uncovered. And we're recognizing the threats like the space, for example. We can talk more about that, but we're starting to become more resilient because we're understanding now the nature of these threats. A lot of the countermeasures are now available, but they haven't been funded and fielded yet. So, gosh, I mean, I could go on into other areas. From a cyber-enabled information warfare perspective against us, education is a big part of that, I think, and then try to convince our political class not to play into their hands, you know, and you know, how is transparency in elections bad? How is that bad, you know? I think we should have the most transparent systems we can have. And verification of voters is not voter suppression. And so the demagoguery should probably stop, and we work together to restore our confidence in who we are as a people, and our confidence in our democratic principles, institutions, and processes.
Question over in the back over here.
I have picked up recently from Frederick Anthony, Planning Council, I think maybe have picked up from George Will, that we need to be considering the next election of our president to be a wartime president. And I think you kind of touched on this subject, but I was wondering if you would have any follow-up thoughts on it.
Yeah, I would say that I think you're right about that. I mean, I do think that whoever comes into office will face challenges that are much more severe than the president's faced in 2017, you know, or in 2021 when they came into office. And again, it's because of this axis of aggressors and the degree to which I think they're emboldened based on the perception of weakness. It's also at a time, as I mentioned, that our military is not resourced properly, or I think prepared in terms of modernization and capacity, especially for these conflicts. I mean, you've seen the reports on naval readiness, for example, recently. We don't have enough ships. We don't have enough squadrons in our Air Force. We don't have enough troops. I mean, we just don't. And I think that the next president, I mean, I don't know if either one of them would be well suited for this, should encourage young Americans to serve and put out a real call for service, and try to counter what I see in the popular narrative, the popular culture these days, is a cheapening and coarsening of our warrior ethos, and a failure to recognize the tremendous rewards of service. And I think that there's a perception these days that our veterans are traumatized, fragile human beings. There's I think a perception that military service is going to always screw you up somehow. And I think this is perpetuated, by some well-meaning organizations as well. And certainly, we would never want to stigmatize again, the sacrifices that are made or the traumatic experiences and their aftermath. But I think it's really important to highlight the rewards of service. It's also important to insulate our military from efforts to drag them into partisan politics. Both President Trump and President Biden have not done well at that. Would President Harris do any better? I mean, I hope she would, but I really just don't. I don't know. I think our political leaders are so far out of touch with our military, our professional military ethic, our military ethos. They just don't get it. And so there are many examples of this, but I think also, it's important for us to teach our young people that our country's worth defending. And when I look at the curriculum that has become dominant in so many universities across the country, I would characterize it as a curriculum of self-loathing. And so if you teach our young generation that their country's not worth defending, who's going to defend us? So thank you.
All right, let's take a question there, and then if we can take the mic over there to the ladies in the red dresses. Go ahead, ma'am.
Let's include some students too.
You're holding the microphone. Go ahead.
Alrighty, General McMaster, I am so pleased to be in your presence as a former military member. We at UCCS are very grateful to be here at this event. So in your latest book, you specify the extreme polarization of America's polity, And you also specify how staff member KT, who was under Henry Kissinger, warned you that friends stab you in the chest in Washington. This, along with Trump's saying that Trump's view on the world was very problematic. How would you say that America's educational structure is responsible for the polarized and hostile state in America? And especially with this concept of our perception of weakness by foreign countries.
Hey, well, thanks a lot for that question. Where did you serve and when did you serve? Where were you?
I was in the Air Force.
It's great. I love the Air Force. My whole career, the bulk of my career, I never had to look up and say, is it friendly or enemy? You know, it was awesome. having the U.S. Air Force on your side is a really great thing if you're on the ground. And we wouldn't be able to get anywhere without it either. So anyway, thanks for the service. So hey, I think what you're alluding to is a really big problem. And I'm in academia. I believe in academia. I'm at a great university at Stanford and also at ASU where I have an affiliation and I get to teach and lecture. And I'm really impressed with our younger generation. But what I do see is that many of our humanities departments have been captured by an orthodoxy. It's an orthodoxy associated with the new left interpretation of history, what some people call, postmodernist or post-colonial theories. Merged into that are various critical theories like critical race theory and others. But what they have in common is they have in common kind of a Marxist interpretation of history. That history is determined by impersonal forces, and that all the problems that we encounter in the world are structural. This is why every problem we encounter we have structural or institutional in front of them. And what I worry about that interpretation of history is not that I think it should be taught, right? We've always had this in the American Academy. You had Charles Mary Beard in the 1930s or William Appleman Williams. I mean, this has been a strain through U.S. historiography. But what happens is when you push that orthodoxy and you don't have alternatives, you leave a younger generation without a sense of agency. And I think you leave them only with a toxic combination of anger and resignation. So what is the alternative? Hey, it's not a contrived, happy view of history, right? It's not, it's not the version of American history that was taught in the Jim Crow South, right? Where slavery was a benign instead of criminal institution, and the Civil War was fought over states' rights, what it is I think a version of history that talks about our republic as being founded on principles that ultimately made the criminal institution of slavery untenable, unsustainable. In contrast to like the 1619 Project, right, which says that our country was founded to preserve slavery. But then we should teach, I think, our young people that we fought our most destructive war in our history to emancipate 6 million of our fellow Americans. But then be forthright with them about the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, separate but unequal, But then we have to teach them as well about the triumphs of the Civil Rights Movement and the end of de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity. Now, does de facto segregation and inequality of opportunity still exist? Heck yes, right? It still matters. It still matters that the zip code into which one is born as to the number of obstacles somebody has to overcome to take advantage of the great promise of our country. Is there something wrong with that? Yes. So let's do something about it. Let's work on those problems together. And so I just think this orthodoxy that has taken over in so many of the humanities departments is disruptive. And what we're seeing that manifest itself today is in this crazy situation where you have young Americans on campuses in pro-Hamas protests or flying Hezbollah flags. I mean, really? Because part of this Marxist interpretation of history teaches young people to categorize the world, to categorize history into the oppressor and the oppressed. And that's a misunderstanding of what driving these conflicts. Where were these protests, right, when the Iranian regime and the Russians were helping the Assad regime kill, wound, and displace half of the Syrian population? The only thing that we do here is self-flagellation because that's what's called for in this orthodoxy. So I do think education is a big aspect of our lack of confidence in our democratic principles, institutions, and processes. Do they need work? I think everybody would agree, heck yes. But I think also our republic has demonstrated a tremendous capacity for self-improvement, and that we should all work together to do that.
When we categorize people on the strata of oppressor and victim, and we valorize victimhood, we rob people of agency. I think it's particularly destructive to the military, where there have been efforts to push this on the military. They're not working. The military is not woke. And also on the other far side of the political spectrum, the military is not extremist, right? But those are narratives you hear. Like on the far left, you hear the military is extremist. On the far right, you hear the military is woke. It's neither one of them. And stop messing around with the military and trying to pull it into partisan politics or to politicize it. So, yeah, I mean, I'm starting to go on about that, but I think there's a big issue in education about the propensity to serve, the willingness to serve, and also the confidence we have to compete internationally.
Let's take two questions over here. Two that are near each other. You have a question too, sir.
Hello, General. General, could you comment on the value of military wargaming with respect to future conflicts, perhaps in the Pacific or in Europe? And if you could maybe provide an example of maybe wargaming in your military, your career, where you saw the real benefit of wargaming, not only maybe for you personally or for your military organization that you support. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hey, I think it's immensely important, right? I'm a huge fan of wargaming. And I mean, it really is just thinking about your interaction with enemies, adversaries, and rivals, and within complex environments. Because what you get out of wargaming is you recognize that the multi-causality of events and evolution of competitions, and you get out of kind of myopic thinking. Tim Gauthier is here, Colonel Tim Gauthier, who I served with in Desert Storm. We wargamed ourselves. We set up in the desert, or we used our Kevlar helmets at times for arrays of the Iraqi forces, as we knew that they would defend from satellite imagery and other methods. And then we did walkthroughs, with our troop on boards, but then physical walkthroughs with tank commanders, Bradley commanders, how we would make contact with the enemy, what battle drills. We changed our battle drills, our formations. And I think the lopsided victory we had at the Battle of 7th Reesting was in large measure due to kind of wargaming at the tactical level. We came up with new indirect fire techniques, for example. But actually, at higher levels, the government, I think, is extremely important as well. And what I advocated for as National Security Advisor was to do a tabletop exercise on North Korea and one on Iran. I was resisted in doing so by, said the book. So, I really believe that what that allows you to do is maybe not predict with a high degree of certainty the exact circumstances or interactions or what occurs, but you can anticipate the different outcomes, and you can identify shortfalls maybe in your capabilities or your doctrine, your tactics, and make adjustments. I'm putting together a war game with a colleague at Hoover. She's fantastic, by the way. Her name is Jacqueline Snyder, an amazing Air Force officer, Air Force Reserve officer, who is a real expert at wargaming. She's done some great work on cyber wargaming. But we're doing a liberty game, and we're going to look at opposition groups within authoritarian regimes, and then how authoritarian regimes use their mechanisms of control to stifle human freedom and deny any kind of opposition to their governments. I'm a huge believer in it, and I think that we need to do more of it. Our defense planning scenarios are terrible. They're fundamentally flawed. I think it's really important to examine the assumptions on which war games rest, and to make sure that you don't, in a war game, do what Clausewitz warned against, which is to try to turn war into something alien to its nature. And I think a lot of war games do that. They try to reduce war into just like a big targeting exercise, and then everybody takes kind of the George Costanza approach to war and just leaves on a high note, when it's finished. And I think that kind of tendency was a setup for some of the difficulties we encountered in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Let's take your question, but before, do we have any other students who have a question? Students are back there? Okay, we'll go there next. Yes, sir.
You mentioned several times that Trump had said he could end the war very quickly. What do you think he has in mind, forcing Zelensky to accept the incursion?
Would you repeat the question?
Okay, so the question is, what does President Trump have in mind when he talks about trying to end the war and being able to end the war in 24 hours? There's actually a paper that was developed in the American First think tank that I think reflects, what he's heard and maybe what he shouted when he made those remarks. First of all, I don't think he believes he can do it, but
excuse me, he's talked to Zelensky since then, but it really calls for an approach in which he would threaten the Russians to try to get them to accede to a ceasefire by threatening them with giving the Ukrainians everything that they need to be able to inflict more loss on the Russians and to gain more ground. And then he would say to the Ukrainians, okay, well, if you don't agree to a ceasefire, I'm going to cut off your assistance. The problem is that a ceasefire really would aid Russia at this point if it was imposed in that way, because it would allow Russia to continue to marshal resources and to be able to continue after kind of reconstituting its onslaught against the Ukrainians. Others have said that maybe there's a hope for a ceasefire if it could contain, Russia giving up some territory, which it has no inclination of doing, and Ukrainian entry into NATO, in which there would be a significant deterrent with the Article 5 provisions of NATO, that Ukraine could be secure, after in a post-ceasefire environment. But I believe that there has never been a ceasefire in war or a negotiated end to war that is inconsistent with the realities on the ground. And so the idea that there could be a favorable outcome for Ukraine without them being able to change the military realities on the ground and doing what, again, Clausewitz said, winning in war requires convincing your enemy that your enemy's been defeated. And I don't think Putin now thinks that he's been defeated. And I think that's what it takes to win. What really bothers me about the way we waged wars in Afghanistan and Iraq is that we forgot almost that it was important to win in war.
Yes.
And you heard these terms like responsible end. Like, what does that mean? I mean, I used to box in high school, in college, admittedly at a much lower weight class. But I never got into the ring and said, I just want to bring this fight to a responsible end. Because you're going to get your ass kicked, right? And the stakes in war are even higher, right? So they're about life and death. So I think you have to try to outdo your enemy, or in this case, help the Ukrainians outdo their enemy. And I think that's how the war ends.
And let's hear from there, and then we're going to go to a student. Go ahead.
Microphone on? Yeah. First of all, General, it's an honor to be here and hear you speak. If I may ask a twofold question as it relates to Armenia, Iraq, and Iran. First, when I was on January 2nd, 2020 in Iraq, that's when they shot General Soleimani, the head of the Iranian National Guard, via drone and killed him. However, it did not appear that the proxy war through the PMF in Iraq stopped much, and they kept, even to this day, still, as you were mentioning, targeting US troops and other US interests. Now to Armenia. I currently work in the Caucasus for the European Union border observation mission between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Obviously, Azerbaijan is a mouthpiece of Putin, but how do you see, we are very concerned, we are strictly observing, but you have Armenia between Iran, which they're trying to have cordial relations with, which I don't blame them for, because the border to Turkey is closed. Azerbaijan, they got these land grabbing issues and human rights violations, and now the only open country up north, Georgia, has elections this week, as you know, very pro-Russia. So Armenia is trying to hold on by a thread, but
Excuse me, we're going to run it. I think you have enough to respond to
yeah,
your question.
yeah. No, I just want to know, how do you see this going in the future, since half the economy of Armenia is relying on Russia, but yes, they're leaning towards the West. How all this ties together with Iran obviously being a major factor towards Iraq as well. But how do you see what is your personal opinion, if I may ask, where is the Caucasus region going?
Okay, so.
And HR, I'm going to ask you, because I want to try to get a few more questions in.
Okay.
How hard is our stop?
We could go a couple.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll try to be just quick here. I really think that the geostrategists, geopolitical theorists of the early 20th century, and I'm talking about Spikeman and others, had the right idea about, from a British perspective, of not allowing Eurasian landmass to be dominated by a hostile power. And I think that's what we see in the alliance with Russia and China. And Spikeman would have described, the
the Caucasus as a shatter zone, a zone of confrontation and conflict around these two revanchist powers. And I think that a lot of the problems that we're seeing with Russia's renewed aggression vis-a-vis Georgia and then really abandoning Armenia. They weren't close to Armenia, completely flipped the script and bandwagoned, with Turkey in support for the Azerbaijan, is because they think that they can just get away with it now, based on really what happened in Afghanistan and our withdrawal from Central Asia. And so what you're seeing is bandwagoning, I think, with Russia and China under the belief that there's no other way to look out for their interests because the United States doesn't have the influence. These countries exist at the far reaches of American power, and that we don't have the will kind of for sustained engagement or to counterbalance. So I think that's what's happening. And I think with Iran, on your question, the reason that we didn't deter more Iranian aggression is because we allowed them to get away with it. After the Soleimani strike, which killed him and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, a horrible human being, with also lots of blood on his hands, we did not respond to the Iranian attack on the Al-Assad air base, which injured a number of our soldiers. We did not respond to a shoot down of a U.S. Reaper drone from Iranian territory. We did not respond to the attacks on the Aramco oil facilities. And then there are many other acts of aggression. The Iranians are like, okay, I guess we can get away with it now. And we never acted like we knew what the return address was. The Biden administration came in, reversed the Trump-Iran policy, and the Iranians, I think, were even more emboldened. So I think it wasn't, the strike against Soleimani, I think, was righteous and important and had an effect on their threat network and set their threat network back along with the financial constraints. But I think the Biden administration's reversal of that, and at the end of the Trump administration, the reluctance to respond emboldened Iran further. Thank you.
Want to be sure we get the student? Where's the microphone? Would you please stand up? You with the glasses, please. Thank you.
Hold on, we actually have one question over here that I'm going to.
No, we're going to take the student, I promised. There we go. We're running short of time.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Well, General, of course, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to learn from your military expertise. And because of that, I wanted to ask about your argument around sanctions and using economic tools right now to diffuse global tensions. Because as a student of economics, my initial response is to say, well, no. Right? We need to up our economic integration because it's not just beneficial for the US, it's beneficial to our trading partners like China. And so if we up our economic integration, then we make...
I'm going to do the same thing. Question.
Pardon. Is it an empirically false statement to say that improving economic integration will reduce the cost of war and make war less likely?
Yes. Okay. Because countries act in interests that go beyond economics, and they convince themselves that the war itself will be economically beneficial. So there's no such thing, right? I believe there's no such thing as an accidental war, right? There are wars that turn out much differently than the aggressors anticipated. But when you look at the writings of the early 20th century that predicted wars passé because of economic integration, I think you hear many of the same arguments today. Right. And mainly made in connection with China, because China has benefited so much from its integration into the world economy, and it's hard to imagine, right, a rending of that economic relationship. But if you look at the decisions that Xi Jinping makes, they don't make sense from an economic perspective, but they do make sense when you think about what really drives and constrains Chinese Communist Party leaders. And that's mainly their fear of losing the party's exclusive grip on power. And that's tied to an ambition that drives them, an ambition to reestablish China's power, to put China at the center, to power to establish exclusionary areas of privacy across the Pacific region, to create new spheres of influence internationally, and to rewrite the rules of international discourse. That's really what he's obsessed with, right? Is this combination of fear and ambition, the ambition associated with the so-called China dream or national rejuvenation. So if you think about some of the decisions he's made lately, Did it make sense to bludgeon Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? Does it make sense for him to lay claim to the ocean through which 1/3 of the world's surface trade flows when free trade has been beneficial to China? Does it make sense for China to have a zero COVID policy that hamstrung their economic recovery? Or does it make sense to crack down on the tech sector, right? And disappear Jack Ma and then crack down on all of the tech sector when it was generating so much income for them? No, it doesn't make sense from an economic perspective because that's not what drives and constrains them. So I think also from the terms in the area of economic interdependence and the reluctance, to have heavy-handed industrial policy, export controls, inbound and outbound investment screening and so forth, I think we have to recognize is the fundamental incompatibility of our free market economies and their statist mercantilist model and what they want to achieve with it. And I'll tell you, it's really important to read their primary sources. A lot of people treat secondary sources from China like they're primary and primary sources like they're secondary. Read what Xi Jinping says. He's the one who wants to decouple. This is what the dual circulation economy is. This is what made China 2025 is to create dependence by us on critical supply chains. So they are insulated from any kind of economic or financial consequences associated with their geopolitical ambitions, right? So, and I believe that when you have a country that's committing genocide, like in Xinjiang, I think genocide should be like an ESG issue, man, like in boardrooms, And if you're talking about doing business with China, investing in China, you should take a Hippocratic oath. Do no hurt or harm in 3 areas. Don't help them develop the weapons that are going to kill your children. Second, which we've done, we've invested in Chinese companies. I mean, $700 million investment by U.S. venture firms into a Chinese company in 2014 that does all the PLA's battlefield artificial intelligence. Congratulations. I hope you got a good return. The second is don't help them perfect their technologically enabled Orwellian police state. A lot of people got great returns with Vision, Sense Time, right? I mean, again, congratulations. And then third, don't help them drive you out of business, right? Look at how many times companies have gone into China and to get access to the Chinese market or access to cheap manufacturing in China, they give up their IP, they go to a joint venture, the Chinese then pick a Chinese winner, shut you out of their domestic market, subsidize that company, Huawei on fifth generation communications hardware, then they dump it on the international market and drive you out of business. I mean, how many times, Elon Musk, does that have to happen, right? I mean, it's not going to happen to him. It happened to everybody else. So, I mean, I would just say the free market principles that I agree with, I'm at the Hoover Institution. I mean, that's Milton Friedman's spot, I mean, if I started talking about heavy-handed industrial policy, the walls would crack. So, I mean, but we're against the adversary here that does not adhere to the same rules.
Let's take the last
General
question.
McMaster, I'm going to allow one final question. This is General Stillwell from the United States Air Force Academy.
Hey, Stilly, what's going on?
Sir, it's so good to see you. You have such a...
Did I do okay with that last one?
You did.
Okay, now this is the guy who's in charge of, at the State Department of a 180-degree shift in our China policy. It did a fantastic job.
Sir, you mentioned you spoke to previous national security advisors. Did you speak to Susan Rice? And the question then becomes, if politics stops at the water's edge, how do we smooth flow? I mean, most elections are based on domestic issues, not international. How do we get our international policy to be more smooth, balanced?
Right. Hey, well, it's a great question. I did talk to Susan Rice. I extended her security clearance, as you might remember, and then they all came after me, the alt-right people. Somebody leaked it, I know who, but anyway. But I did it for all previous national security advisors. But I think that what's really important is to break this habit of a new administration coming in and defining their foreign policy mainly as in opposition to their predecessor. And there should be a lot of things we can agree on in the area of foreign policy. And as you know, we try to foster bipartisan support for the China strategy and policy. That worked. It is one element of very clear continuity between the Trump and the Biden administrations. And we had to convince them. I mean, we had to convince ourselves, the government broadly. But that was not the case, that they would accept that approach, and they were very critical of it during the Trump administration. One of the ways to do it, I think, is with framing these problems, as I mentioned. Get common understanding of the nature of the challenge we're facing. Educate people about that. then bring in members of Congress, which is not maybe the National Security Advisor's role, maybe state does it, who knows, but have conversations with the congressional staffs. This is why I think the China Select Committee was so darn good. It was a really, no kidding, nonpartisan effort to try to get at that. And I really applaud the Republican and Democratic leaders of the China Select Committee. If you haven't read that report, it's definitely worth reading. And the recommendations are solid. I think they lay out a multi-administration approach to China policy in a very clear way. So I think that's another technique. And then finally, I think it's the World Affairs Council. I think it's your job, and you're doing a great job of it, because we will get the policy. I think the policies that the American people demand, and an educated, engaged public like you, I think, is so important to generate that, to transcend the partisanship. And so that's what's been such a privilege to be with all of you. And Jim, thank you, and Karen, thank you so much for the privilege of being with you, all you guys. It's really great to see you.